The wind blowing off Lake Michigan carried a brutal, biting chill that November morning, slicing through the gray streets of Chicago long before the sun even thought about rising. At 5:45 a.m., the city was nothing more than a collection of shadows and frost. Yet at the absolute farthest edge of O'Hare International Airport, tucked away behind a labyrinth of restricted service roads and towering chain-link fences, lay a hidden terminal. There were no flashing neon signs here, no crowded drop-off lanes, no tired families dragging overly stuffed suitcases. This particular terminal operated on a very strict, unspoken rule. If you had to rely on a GPS to find it, you simply did not belong here. It was a sterile, ultra-exclusive sanctuary built for the fraction of a percent who bought airspace the way normal people bought groceries. A sleek, completely unmarked black SUV glided to a halt at the terminal's discreet side entrance. The tires crunched softly against the frost-covered asphalt, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. The engine purred deep and heavy before cutting out entirely. The driver, a broad-shouldered man wearing a tailored dark suit, made absolutely no move to open his door. He just sat there, his eyes fixed firmly straight ahead, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. He knew better than to interfere. A moment later, the heavy rear door of the SUV swung open from the inside. Elias Thorne stepped out into the freezing air. He did not look like a man who moved markets with a single text message. He did not look like the invisible architect behind one of the most ruthless and sprawling corporate empires on the eastern seaboard. At 34 years old, Elias stood 6 feet and 3 inches tall, his frame lean but packed with the kind of coiled, dangerous muscle that expensive suits were designed to camouflage. But he wasn't wearing a suit today.
He wore a plain faded charcoal thermal hemless, slightly unbuttoned at the collar, and a heavily worn dark denim jacket that had seen better decades. A pair of scuffed, heavy-duty leather boots completed the look. He had the rough, unshaven jawline of a man who hadn't slept in 72 hours, and thick, dark hair that looked as though it had been aggressively pushed back by restless fingers rather than styled. His face was a masterclass in absolute stillness. The sharp angles of his cheekbones and the strong, unforgiving line of his jaw gave him a distinctly intimidating silhouette, but it was his eyes that forced people to look away. They were a pale, icy gray, the color of a frozen lake right before the ice cracks. There was no warmth in them, no exhaustion either, only a terrifying, calculating emptiness. Tucked partially beneath the collar of his Henley, resting heavily against his chest, was a thick, platinum chain holding a tarnished silver medallion. It was the only visible piece of metal on his body, aside from a deep, jagged scar that slashed across the back of his right hand. Elias leaned back into the cavernous interior of the SUV. When he stood upright again, he was no longer just a man bracing against the cold. He was a shield. Cradled against his broad chest was a 7-year-old girl. Her name was Mia. She was fast asleep, her tiny face buried deep into the rough fabric of Elias's denim jacket. A thick, oversized wool blanket swallowed her small frame, completely wrapping her in warmth. One of her little hands was out gripping the fabric of his shirt with a desperate white-knuckled tightness, as if she instinctively knew that he was the only solid, immovable thing left in her crumbling universe. Elias adjusted her weight with effortless ease, wrapping one large scarred hand firmly around her back. With his free hand, he reached into the vehicle and effortlessly hauled out a heavy, scuffed black canvas duffel bag. He slung the thick strap over his shoulder. The bag looked cheap, on the kind of luggage a college student might drag onto a Greyhound bus. He didn't look back at the driver. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked toward the glass sliding doors of the terminal. His footsteps were completely silent, a predatory grace that seemed entirely at odds with his massive frame. Inside the terminal, the lighting was warm amber and meticulously designed to soothe the nerves of anxious billionaires. A man stood behind the polished mahogany reception desk. He had worked this highly restricted desk for 15 years, memorizing the faces of tech moguls, royal family members, and aggressive hedge fund managers. When he looked up and saw Elias Thorne walking through the glass doors wearing faded denim and carrying a cheap canvas bag, the receptionist did not ask for a boarding pass. He did not ask for a passport. He did not even utter a greeting. The receptionist simply stood up his spine, snapping perfectly straight, and offered a single deeply respectful nod. It wasn't the polite nod of customer service. It was the tight, fearful nod of a man who understood exactly who was walking past him. Elias barely dipped his chin in response. He didn't break his stride. He moved past the mahogany desk, past the velvet-lined waiting lounges, and walked straight through the private security corridor. No alarms beeped. No metal detectors were switched on. The rules of commercial aviation, and indeed, the laws of ordinary gravity, simply did not apply to the man currently carrying a sleeping orphan against his chest. He was carrying her because of a promise made to a man who had taken a bullet meant for Elias just 3 weeks ago, a man who had bled out on a warehouse floor while begging Elias to protect his only daughter. Elias had promised, and Elias Thorne, the man who systematically destroyed rival companies just for the sport of it, was a man who kept his promises to the dead. He pushed through the final set of heavy double doors, stepping out onto the frost-covered tarmac, where the absolute silence of the morning was broken only by the low, humming whine of jet engines. Billionaire / CEO protective romance gem Tuai Chin. The biting wind of the Chicago tarmac whipped fiercely around Elias as he stepped completely out of the terminal's protective overhang. The bitter cold bit at his exposed neck, but he didn't flinch. His entire focus was anchored on the massive sweeping machine resting quietly on the concrete apron 50 yards ahead. It was a Gulfstream G650ER, the absolute pinnacle of long-range private aviation. But unlike the gleaming white jets belonging to hedge fund managers or real estate tycoons that usually populated this airport, this particular aircraft was painted entirely in a custom, light-absorbing matte black. It looked less like a luxury transport and more like a military stealth asset. The tail number painted in a subtle dark charcoal gray that made it nearly impossible to read from a distance was registered to Obsidian Holdings LLC. It was a phantom corporation, a shell company, buried beneath 5 different layers of offshore legal architecture. There were no public records, no board of directors, no corporate headquarters. Elias Thorne owned it entirely. He had purchased it in cash 3 years ago. Yet his name had never once appeared on a flight manifest. As Elias walked across the frost-covered tarmac, a fueling technician and a baggage handler standing near the aircraft's enormous landing gear stopped their conversation abruptly. They didn't know Elias's name. They had no idea what he looked like on the cover of Forbes because he refused to be photographed. But men who worked the private ramps developed a sixth sense for genuine terrifying power. They saw a giant of a man in faded denim and heavy boots, carrying a sleeping child and a cheap canvas duffel bag, and their instinct screamed at them to freeze. Usually, ground crews would rush forward, offering sycophantic smiles, eager to take a client's luggage or offer an umbrella. Not today. The way Elias moved silent, predatory, his icy gray eyes locked dead ahead, broadcasted a clear, unspoken warning. Do not approach. Do not speak. Do not exist in my space. The 2 ground workers simply lowered their heads, stepping back into the shadows of the wings, holding their breath until he passed. Elias reached the bottom of the air stairs. He climbed them slowly, methodically, his heavy leather boots making a muted rhythmic thud against the thick plush carpet of the steps. He ducked his head slightly to clear the low frame of the cabin door, stepping out of the freezing wind and into the climate-controlled sanctuary of the Gulfstream. The interior of the cabin was a staggering masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic wealth. It smelled faintly of expensive leather ozone and meticulously polished wood. The main cabin featured wide, custom-stitched cream leather captain's chairs, handcrafted Macassar ebony tables, and brushed champagne gold accents that caught the soft, recessed LED lighting. It was an environment designed entirely to intimidate business rivals and coddle royalty. Elias didn't even glance at it. He was completely immune to this kind of luxury. He didn't just live in it. He manufactured the economies that allowed it to exist. To him, this $70 million machine was nothing more than a secure, heavily armored steel tube meant to transport him and the little girl in his arms from one location to another without being tracked. He bypassed the main seating area, moving directly toward the private rear compartment, separated by a thick sliding wooden partition. The rear cabin was darker, quieter, and infinitely more private. He stopped at the widest seat, a massive lounger that could fold completely flat. With agonizing care, Elias lowered Mia into the soft leather seat. The massive scarred hands that had ruined billion-dollar conglomerates and just days ago physically broken the men responsible for her father's death were now moving with the feather-light gentleness of a ghost. He unbuckled the heavy wool blanket, making sure it covered her perfectly up to her chin. He adjusted her dark curls, brushing them away from her sleeping eyes. Mia let out a soft, tiny sigh, shifting her weight, but she didn't wake. Her small hands remained curled into fists. Elias stood over her for a long moment. The exhaustion of the past 3 weeks threatened to pull him under, but he forced it down, locking it away in a dark corner of his mind. He had arranged funerals, liquidated shell companies, and erased an entire syndicate off the map to ensure that the bullet meant for him. The bullet his best friend had taken was paid for in absolute permanent blood. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was getting Mia to her grandmother's heavily guarded estate in Ohio safely. He unslung the cheap canvas duffel bag from his shoulder, setting it silently on the floor next to his own seat across from hers. He unzipped the main compartment, reached inside, and pulled out a small, slightly worn stuffed rabbit with one floppy ear. It had been her father's parting gift to her months ago. Elias gently tucked the rabbit under Mia's arm. She instinctively pulled it tight against her chest, her breathing evening out into a deep, peaceful rhythm.
Satisfied, Elias finally sat down in the seat opposite her. He stretched his long legs out, leaving his denim jacket unbuttoned. He rested his elbows on the armrests, interlacing his fingers, and stared out the small oval window at the gray Chicago skyline. He looked exactly like what he wanted the world to see today: a tired, poor, invisible man. From the forward galley hidden behind the partition, Julian, the 24-year-old junior flight attendant, watched the reflection of the tall man in the polished wood paneling. Julian had seen the worn jacket. He had seen the cheap canvas bag. But Julian was fiercely observant. He noticed the way the man had boarded without a single security check. He noticed the absolute bone-chilling silence that commanded the space around him. Julian felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He immediately decided he was going to stay out of this man's way.
Unfortunately, his senior attendant, Vanessa Vance, was about to make the exact opposite decision. In the immaculate, brilliantly lit forward galley of the Gulfstream, Vanessa Vance was busy adjusting the pristine knot of her silk uniform scarf in a silver-framed mirror. At 38 years old, Vanessa possessed the kind of sharp, aggressively manicured beauty that required immense effort and expense to maintain. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless French twist, not a single strand permitted out of place. Her uniform, a tailored navy blue pencil skirt, and a crisp white blazer, was pressed to razor-sharp perfection. Vanessa had spent 12 years working in elite private aviation. Over that decade, she had served foreign diplomats, Hollywood royalty, and tech billionaires. By proximity, she had gradually convinced herself that she belonged to their world.
She possessed an overwhelming toxic arrogance, defining her entire personal worth by the net worth of the passengers she served. She viewed herself not as a service worker, but as an exclusive gatekeeper to the ultra-rich. She knew the difference between a Rolex and a Patek Philippe from 10 paces. She could spot a bespoke Savile Row suit before the passenger even reached the top of the air stairs. And more importantly, Vanessa Vance violently despised poverty. She hated the unpolished, the ordinary, and the cheap. To her, the lower classes were an aesthetic offense, a stain on the immaculate, luxurious world she had worked so hard to integrate herself into. She picked up a crystal flute, polishing it with a microfiber cloth until it sparkled under the recessed galley lights. The charter today was listed simply under a blind corporate account. Vanessa had naturally assumed it would be an executive board or a wealthy foreign investor.
She had chilled the vintage Dom Perignon and arranged the beluga caviar on a silver platter, ready to charm whoever stepped on board. "Excuse me, Vanessa." Vanessa paused, lowering the crystal flute. She turned slowly to look at Julian, the junior flight attendant who was standing near the galley entrance. He looked pale, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. "What is it, Julian?" Vanessa snapped, her voice clipped and impatient. She hated when the junior staff interrupted her preparation. "Are the clients boarding?" Someone boarded," Julian whispered, glancing anxiously toward the sliding wooden partition that separated the front of the aircraft from the rear cabin. "But I don't think it's the client. He just walked right on. He didn't speak to the ground crew. He didn't show an ID." Vanessa's perfectly plucked eyebrows crashed together. What do you mean he just walked right on? Did security clear him? I don't know. Julian swallowed hard. He's sitting in the VIP rear lounge, and he brought a kid with him. Vanessa's lips thinned into a tight, hard line. A sudden wave of indignant rage flared in her chest. An unauthorized person on her jet. In her pristine cabin, she shoved the microfiber cloth onto the granite counter. Stay here, she ordered Julian sharply. Do not touch the caviar. Vanessa marched out of the galley, the sharp authoritative click-clack of her designer heels echoing against the hardwood flooring of the forward cabin. She pushed past the heavy velvet curtains and slid open the Macassar ebony partition, her chin held high, fully prepared to politely but firmly eject some lost, confused airport mechanic or arrogant ramp worker who had wandered onto the wrong aircraft. She stepped into the rear cabin and stopped. Her cold, assessing eyes immediately locked onto the man sitting in the oversized cream leather lounger. Vanessa's internal radar, honed by 12 years of judging extreme wealth, went off like a blaring siren, but not in a good way. She scanned him from the ground up, her disgust mounting with every passing second. First, she saw the boots. Heavy, scuffed brown leather work boots. They looked like they belonged on a construction site, currently resting aggressively close to the plush, custom-woven silk carpet that cost more than most people's annual salary. Her gaze moved up. Dark, faded denim jeans, a cheap, unremarkable charcoal thermal shirt that clung to his broad chest, and the jacket, a heavy, heavily worn denim jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in a week. No designer labels, no custom tailoring, no expensive watch glittering on his wrist. Then her eyes darted to the floor next to him. A frayed black canvas duffel bag. It was the kind of cheap, mass-produced garbage you could buy for $20 at a discount store. The absolute audacity of allowing that filthy piece of canvas to touch the Gulfstream's floor made Vanessa's blood boil. Finally, she looked at the child. The little girl was fast asleep on the marmot multi-thousand-dollar leather seat, wrapped in a coarse, ordinary wool blanket, clutching a ragged, cheap, stuffed rabbit. Vanessa's upper lip curled into an involuntary sneer. This wasn't just a mistake. This was an insult. This man was not a billionaire. He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't even a low-level executive. To Vanessa's highly trained, deeply prejudiced eyes, he looked like a mechanic, a rogue security guard, or worse, some desperate lower-class father who thought he could sneak onto a private jet to give his kid a thrill ride before getting caught. She did not see the terrifying stillness in his posture. She did not notice that his plain clothes hid a physique built for lethal violence. She entirely missed the dangerous, icy calculation in his pale gray eyes as he stared silently out the window. She was completely blinded by her own snobbery. She only saw a poor man, a nobody, a stain on her perfect morning. A surge of righteous, cruel authority pumped through her veins. She was the senior attendant of this aircraft. She was the protector of this elite space. It was her absolute duty to keep the trash out. Vanessa took a deep breath, pasting on her most condescending, lethal customer service smile. She squared her shoulders, stepped fully into the rear cabin, and prepared to utterly humiliate the man who had dared to track his poverty onto her jet. Vanessa stopped 2 feet away from the luxurious leather lounger. She clasped her manicured hands in front of her pristine white blazer, her posture rigid with practiced authority. She looked down at the man in the faded denim jacket, allowing her silence to stretch for a few excruciating seconds.
She expected him to squirm, to look up with the wide-eyed panic of someone who had been caught sneaking around where they didn't belong. Elias did not squirm. He didn't even turn his head. He continued to stare out the oval window at the frost-covered tarmac, his breathing slow, rhythmic and perfectly even. The massive silver chain around his neck glinted faintly in the ambient cabin lights, a stark, rugged contrast to his surroundings. Vanessa's fake customer service smile tightened, pulling at the corners of her lips. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that thinly veiled her overwhelming contempt. "I need to ask you to return to the commercial terminal. This aircraft is a private, pre-booked charter." Silence. The low, steady hum of the Gulfstream's auxiliary power unit was the absolute only sound in the cabin. Vanessa's eyes flashed with genuine irritation.
She stepped closer, her designer heels sinking aggressively into the custom silk carpet. "Sir, I am speaking to you. You cannot be on this aircraft. I don't know how you slipped past ground security at the gate, but if you do not collect your belongings." She cast a scathing, disgusted glance at the cheap frayed canvas duffel bag on the floor. "And exit this cabin immediately. I will be forced to call the airport police." Elias finally moved. He turned his head slowly, his movement deliberate and entirely devoid of urgency. His pale, icy gray eyes locked dead onto Vanessa's face. For a fraction of a second, Vanessa felt a bizarre, inexplicable jolt of pure terror shoot up her spine. The man's gaze was not apologetic. It wasn't embarrassed. It was the cold, terrifyingly calculating look of an apex predator assessing whether an insect was worth the energy required to crush it. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly heavy, suffocating, as if the oxygen had been quietly and systematically sucked out of the room. But Vanessa quickly shook off the feeling, her arrogance protecting her. She was shielded by her uniform, her seniority, and the ironclad rules of the elite world she served. This was just a stubborn lower-class man trying to save face in front of his kid. "I am the senior flight attendant on this jet," Vanessa continued, her tone sharpening into a harsh, condescending reprimand. "This is not a joyride. This aircraft is chartered by Obsidian Holdings. Unless you can produce a verified boarding authorization and matching government identification, you are trespassing." Elias held her gaze. He didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight in his seat. The sheer crushing weight of his silence was overwhelming. It was a weaponized silence, the exact same terrifying tactic Elias Thorne used in glass boardrooms to make seasoned, ruthless executives sweat panic and ultimately break. Vanessa's jaw clenched. The absolute lack of submission infuriated her. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed, completely abandoning her professional facade. "I deal with important, powerful people every single day. I know exactly who belongs on a $70 million jet and who doesn't. You, with your dirty boots and your knockoff bag, do not belong here. Get up." Before Elias could react, a small, soft voice broke the suffocating tension. "Uncle Eli." Elias's terrifying demeanor vanished in an absolute instant. The freezing ice in his gray eyes melted into a profound, aching gentleness. He turned away from Vanessa, immediately leaning forward over the massive leather seat. Mia was waking up. Her dark curls were messy, her large, sleep-filled eyes blinking rapidly against the bright cabin lights. She clutched the worn stuffed rabbit tighter, looking around the unfamiliar, opulent space with a heavy hint of childhood anxiety. "I'm right here, little bird," Elias murmured. His voice, speaking for the first time, was a deep, gravelly rumble, surprisingly soft and completely devoid of the violence his massive frame suggested. He reached out, with his large scarred hand, gently cupping the side of her small face. His thumb stroked her cheek with practiced, fiercely protective care. "You're safe. Go back to sleep." Mia's gaze drifted past Elias's broad shoulder and landed directly on Vanessa. Children possess a raw, unfiltered instinct for danger, and Mia instantly shrank back, pulling the heavy wool blanket higher over her chin. She didn't like the angry woman with the sharp face. Elias noticed the child's reaction. The gentleness in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced instantly by a chilling, absolute zero glare as he slowly turned back to Vanessa. Vanessa crossed her arms, completely unmoved by the little girl. In her twisted mind, dragging a child into this trespassing stunt only made the man more pathetic. "I don't care if you have a child with you," she snapped, her voice cold and merciless. "You are scaring her by forcing a scene. Be a responsible parent for once in your life and leave before I have you dragged out of here in handcuffs." Elias looked at her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up to intimidate her with his massive height. He simply sat there, radiating a dark, lethal authority that commanded the very gravity of the room. "Call the operations desk," Elias said quietly. His voice was smooth, dark, and utterly flat. "Tell them to pull the tail number." Vanessa let out a short, mocking, high-pitched laugh. "I absolutely will not waste my time humoring a trespasser. I don't take orders from people who sneak onto my plane." "Then get off it," Elias replied. 3 simple words, delivered with the heavy, inescapable finality of a judge passing a death sentence. Vanessa gasped, her face flushing a deep, furious crimson. "Excuse me." Elias turned his face back to the oval window, dismissing her entirely. He had made his assessment. The insect was not worth any more of his breath. Vanessa stood there, trembling with a mix of shock and humiliated rage. Nobody spoke to her like that. Nobody. She spun on her designer heels, storming aggressively back toward the forward galley. She was going to call ground security. She was going to make sure this arrogant poor loser was thrown out onto the tarmac so violently he would regret the day he was born. She had absolutely no idea she was about to light a match inside a powder keg. Vanessa marched blindly back into the forward galley. The sharp, aggressive click of her designer heels sounding like rapid gunfire in the otherwise pristine silence of the aircraft.
Her face was flushed, a deep, ugly shade of crimson, her perfectly manicured nails biting harshly into the soft palms of her hands. Her pulse hammered relentlessly in her ears, driven entirely by a toxic cocktail of indignant rage and deeply ingrained snobbery. How dare he? How dare a man wearing dirty work boots and a faded, unwashed denim jacket speak to her with such dismissing authority? She was Vanessa Vance. She served foreign dignitaries and tech moguls. She did not take orders from a pathetic lower-class squatter who had somehow managed to sneak past a lazy ground crew. Julian was standing near the polished espresso machine, his face entirely drained of color. He had heard the entire exchange through the thin gap in the wooden partition. He watched Vanessa storm toward the communication panel, her eyes wide and furious, and a deep, nauseating sense of dread plummeted into the pit of his stomach.
Vanessa, wait, Julian pleaded, taking a hesitant step forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. Please just take a breath. Maybe we should just look up the tail number in the system like he asked. I was reviewing the charter notes this morning, and there's a massive red-level confidentiality flag on this flight. Vanessa slammed her hand violently onto the cold granite counter, shutting him up instantly. A confidentiality flag for a corporate shell account is completely standard, Julian. She hissed, her voice venomous and razor-sharp. It means executives don't want the financial press tracking their movements. It absolutely does not mean we allow unwashed vagrants and their brats to set up camp in our multi-million-dollar VIP lounge. But he bypassed the entire terminal security protocol, Julian argued desperately, his voice trembling as he realized his senior attendant was walking blindly off a cliff.
Nobody gets onto this private tarmac without top-tier clearance. Nobody. What if he actually belongs here? What if he's what Julian, a billionaire? Vanessa let out a shrill, incredibly mocking laugh that echoed unpleasantly in the small space. She grabbed the heavy black intercom handset from the wall mount. Do you honestly, truly believe that a man who controls a $70 million Gulfstream dresses like a homeless drifter? Did you see that disgusting canvas bag? Did you see those boots? He is a trespassing squatter attempting to give his kid a joyride. He slipped in because the ramp crew is incompetent, and I am putting a stop to it right now. Julian opened his mouth to protest one last time, to beg her to reconsider, but the absolute arrogant certainty in Vanessa's eyes terrified him into silence. He took a slow step backward, physically distancing himself from the catastrophic mistake she was about to make.
He decided right then and there that he would not go down with her ship. Vanessa aggressively punched the speed dial button for the private terminal's ground operations center. The line rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. Obsidian Ground Ops. This is dispatch. Go ahead, Vance. Vanessa straightened her posture, lifting her chin as she assumed her most authoritative, uncompromising tone. Dispatch, this is Vance, Senior Attendant on the G650. I need a full tactical ground security team on board this aircraft immediately. Bring the airport police if you have to. There was a brief, confused pause on the other end. Vance, we don't have any alerts on your gate. What is the nature of the emergency? We have an unauthorized male and a child in the rear cabin, Vanessa stated loudly, deliberately projecting her voice so the man in the back could hear exactly what was happening. She wanted him to sweat. She wanted him to feel the humiliating panic of being caught.
He is refusing to produce any boarding documentation or government identification. He is highly uncooperative, verbally hostile, and dressed like a vagrant. I want him forcefully removed from my cabin before any actual clients arrive. Copy that, Vance, the dispatcher replied, a note of urgency finally entering his voice. We are sending the head of security and a backup unit now. Do not engage the trespasser further. They will be at your stairs in 3 minutes. Make it 2, Vanessa snapped, slamming the handset back onto the receiver with a triumphant, deeply satisfying click. She turned to Julian, a cruel, vindictive smirk playing on her flawlessly painted lips. That is how you handle trash, Julian. You don't negotiate, you throw it out. She crossed her arms and leaned against the galley counter, staring intently at the heavy wooden partition.
She was already mentally drafting the glowing incident report, imagining the effusive praise she would receive from the hidden executives of Obsidian Holdings for fiercely protecting their incredibly expensive asset. She pictured the man being dragged out in handcuffs, his little girl crying, finally learning his place in the world. In the rear cabin, Elias had heard every single shrill, desperate word. The acoustic paneling of the Gulfstream was exceptional, but it couldn't fully mute a woman who was actively trying to be heard. Elias didn't flinch. His broad shoulders didn't tense. The terrifying, icy calm that radiated from him never broke. He remained exactly where he was. His long legs stretched out, his eyes staring blankly at the frosted window. The only movement he made was a slow, deliberate tightening of his scarred hand around Mia's small shoulder. Mia shifted under the heavy wool blanket, her brow furrowing in her sleep. The loud, angry voices from the front had disturbed her. "Uncle Eli," she mumbled, her voice thick with exhaustion and a rising tide of childhood anxiety. "Is the loud lady mad at us?" Elias leaned down, his face entirely softening as he pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her messy, dark curls. His thumb stroked her cheek in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "She's not mad, little bird," Elias whispered, his deep voice a rumbling, impenetrable fortress of safety. "She just made a very poor decision. Go back to sleep. I won't let anyone touch you." Mia sighed instinctively, trusting the man who had promised her dying father he would protect her. She buried her face deeper into his faded denim jacket and drifted back into a peaceful sleep. Elias slowly lifted his head, his pale gray eyes drifting away from the child and locking onto the wooden partition that separated him from the forward galley. The gentleness vanished, swallowed entirely by a dark, lethal void. 3 minutes later, the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed loudly against the exterior air stairs. Security had arrived. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed sharply against the exterior aluminum of the air stairs. To Vanessa Vance, that aggressive metallic sound was an absolute victory march. She stood at the very edge of the forward galley, her posture impeccably straight, her manicured hands clasped elegantly in front of her pristine white blazer. She had already taken a moment to smooth away the ugly flush of anger from her cheeks, perfectly replacing it with the deeply concerned, highly professional expression of a senior attendant who was bravely managing a severe security threat. In the corner of the galley, Julian stood completely frozen, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He felt sick to his stomach. He didn't know who the man in the back was, but every single instinct in his body was screaming that Vanessa was making a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. The heavy cabin door was pushed wider, letting in a biting gust of freezing Chicago wind, followed immediately by 2 large men in dark tactical uniforms. Leading them was Marcus, the head of ground security for the private VIP terminal. Marcus was 50 years old, a heavily scarred former Marine who had spent the last decade guarding the secrets and the physical safety of foreign dignitaries, aggressive billionaires, and royalty. He was a hardened man who did not rattle easily. He had broken up physical fights between drunken heirs and quietly disposed of armed stalkers trying to scale the perimeter fences. "Marcus, thank God you're here," Vanessa breathed, stepping forward with just the right amount of manufactured relief in her voice.
I am so incredibly sorry to call you out here in that freezing cold, but we have a critical hostile situation. Marcus stepped into the opulent forward cabin, his sharp dark eyes immediately sweeping the pristine area, assessing for threats. Dispatch said you have an uncooperative trespasser, Vance. Where is he? In the rear VIP lounge, Vanessa said, her voice dripping with practiced aristocratic disdain as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the partially open Macassar ebony partition. He slipped past the incompetent ramp crew. He has absolutely no identification, no boarding authorization, and he is flatly refusing to leave. He also dragged a child on board, presumably to use her as some sort of sympathetic shield. I need him forcefully removed immediately before the actual paying clients arrive. Marcus gave a single tight nod. He unclipped the heavy 2-way radio from his belt, his thumb resting instinctively near his holstered sidearm.
He was fully prepared for a frantic, desperate squatter, or perhaps a deeply disturbed fan who had somehow tracked a celebrity's tail number. He pushed past the heavy velvet curtains and stepped fully into the rear cabin, his backup officer following closely right behind him. Vanessa followed right on their heels. A cruel, vindictive smirk finally broke through her perfectly maintained professional mask. She absolutely could not wait to see the smug, silent arrogance violently ripped away from the man in the dirty denim jacket. She desperately wanted to see him dragged out into the freezing wind in handcuffs, completely humiliated. "Sir!" Marcus barked, his voice carrying the heavy, booming authority of a man accustomed to absolute, unquestioned obedience. "Stand up and step away from the seat. You are trespassing on highly restricted private property, and you are going to—" Marcus stopped. He didn't just pause.
His entire massive muscular body violently seized, completely locking up as if he had just stepped directly onto a live landmine. In the oversized, multi-$1,000 cream leather lounger, Elias Thorne had not moved a single muscle. His long legs were still comfortably stretched out. His massive scarred hand was still resting gently protectively on the wool blanket covering the sleeping little girl. He slowly, deliberately turned his head away from the frosted window. His pale, icy gray eyes locked dead onto the head of security. Marcus stopped breathing. Marcus knew the tail number of this matte black Gulfstream. Every senior security officer on the terminal's payroll knew it legally belonged to Obsidian Holdings. But unlike Vanessa, Marcus had a security clearance that went 3 levels deeper than a flight attendant's.
3 years ago, during a highly classified, closed-door security briefing regarding the terminal's most dangerous, powerful, and secretive clients, Marcus had been shown a single blurry photograph. He had been given very specific, terrifying instructions by the airport's board of directors. If you ever see this man on the tarmac, you do not ask for his ID. You do not stop him. You do not speak to him unless spoken to. You give him absolutely whatever he wants, and you pray to God he doesn't notice you. Now staring at the faded charcoal Henley, the heavy, unwashed denim jacket, the brutal scar slashed across the hand, and the heavy platinum medallion resting against the man's broad chest, Marcus felt all the blood drain entirely from his face. The air in the luxury cabin suddenly felt as thin and freezing as the stratosphere. He wasn't looking at a trespasser. He was looking at Elias Thorne, the Phantom, the apex predator of the corporate underworld, the man who owned the jet, the runway, the private terminal, and very likely the ground Marcus was currently standing on. And Vanessa Vance, a flight attendant with a superiority complex, had just called armed security to forcefully drag him off his own plane. Marcus felt a cold, terrifying bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck, despite the freezing draft blowing in from the open cabin door. The absolute stillness of the man sitting in the chair wasn't the stubbornness of a squatter. It was the dark, lethal patience of a god watching mortals eagerly dig their own graves. Vanessa, standing just behind Marcus's broad shoulder, couldn't see the security chief's terrified face. She only saw that he had abruptly frozen. Her irritation spiked immediately. Why wasn't he grabbing the man, Marcus? Vanessa snapped impatiently, her shrill voice shattering the heavy silence. She stepped out from behind him, her hands on her hips. What on earth are you waiting for? Grab him. Look at his filthy boots. He's ruining the custom silk carpet. Get him off my aircraft, right this second. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at Vanessa. His eyes were wide, filled with a sickening mixture of absolute horror and a deep, profound pity. He looked at her exactly the way a coroner looks at a mangled body that has just been pulled from a devastating car wreck. He realized, with absolute chilling certainty, that Vanessa Vance's career, her reputation, and possibly her entire life in Chicago had just ended. She just didn't know it yet. "Ma'am," Marcus whispered. His voice was trembling so violently he could barely form the single word. Vanessa frowned, her perfectly plucked eyebrows knitting together in deep, arrogant confusion. "Why are you whispering? He's a nobody. Stop wasting time and just drag him out." Marcus didn't listen to her. He couldn't. His overwhelming survival instincts were screaming at him to de-escalate the catastrophic, unforgivable mistake this flight attendant had just made. He slowly turned back to face Elias. He didn't reach for his radio. He quickly pulled his hand far away from his sidearm. Instead, the 50-year-old, hardened former Marine, A man who intimidated everyone at the airport slowly and deliberately lowered his head, his chin touching his chest in a gesture of absolute, total submission. "Sir," Marcus said, and this time his voice wasn't a booming command. It was a breathless, terrified apology. I, I deeply apologize for the interruption. I just need to run a quick standard verification. Just for the dispatch logs. May I please have the tail number of this aircraft?" Elias looked at the terrified security chief. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. The icy, terrifying void in his gray eyes remained entirely unchanged.
Golf 650, Elias said softly, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating through the heavy silence of the cabin. "Sierra Tango Black." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the suffocating quiet. He slowly raised his radio to his mouth, his large hand visibly shaking. Marcus's thick thumb hesitated heavily over the transmit button of his two-way radio. His hand, a large, deeply scarred paw that had easily subdued armed men on the tarmac, was visibly shaking. The suffocating silence inside the $70 million cabin pressed against his eardrums heavy and absolute. He took a shallow, uneven breath, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the polished wood floor, absolutely terrified to meet the pale, icy gray gaze of the man sitting just a few feet away in the leather lounger. "Dispatch," Marcus said, his usually booming, authoritative voice reduced to a dry, raspy croak. "Run a priority verification on tail number Golf 650 Sierra, Tango Black."
Override all standard masks. Confirm principal status. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the soft, rhythmic hum of the Gulfstream's auxiliary power unit and the faint, tense crackle of radio static. Then the dispatcher's voice came through. It wasn't the crisp, bored tone from 3 minutes ago. It was tight, elevated, laced with sudden, unmistakable panic. "Marcus, that tail number is a level 1 blackout, registered to the primary holding shell of Obsidian. Operations just received a secure ping that the principal client is on board. Repeat, the principal is in the cabin. Abort all security interventions immediately. Do you copy?" Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. "Copy, dispatch. We are standing down. Clear the channel." He unclipped his thumb from the button and let the radio drop limply back to his hip. He didn't dare say another word to Elias. He simply gave another slow, deeply respectful bow of his head, slowly backing away toward the forward galley.
His backup officer, realizing the terrifying gravity of the situation without needing to be told, mirrored the exact same motion, holstering his own radio and stepping backward in silent retreat. Vanessa stood rigidly in the aisle, her perfectly manicured hands twitching. Her brain, completely poisoned by a decade of unchecked snobbery, was violently refusing to process what was happening. Why was Marcus bowing? Why was dispatch panicking? Why wasn't this unwashed, arrogant squatter being dragged out by his throat? "Marcus," Vanessa hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper as she lunged forward, aggressively grabbing the security chief's heavy tactical sleeve. "What are you doing? I gave you a direct order to remove him. You can't just stand down." Marcus ripped his arm away from her grip with sudden, terrifying violence.
He grabbed Vanessa by the elbow, his thick fingers digging painfully into her pristine white blazer, and forcefully yanked her backward, dragging her behind the Macassar ebony partition and completely out of Elias's direct line of sight. "Let go of me!" Vanessa gasped, her eyes wide with furious, indignant rage. "Have you completely lost your mind?" "Shut your mouth," Marcus snarled. The hardened former Marine was sweating profusely, a stark, bizarre contrast to the freezing draft blowing in from the open cabin door. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Do you have any idea who that is?" Vanessa scoffed, tossing her flawless blonde French twist. "He's a nobody. Look at him. He's wearing dirty. That is Elias Thorne," Marcus hissed, his voice cracking with sheer unadulterated desperation. "Elias Thorne, the founder of Obsidian Holdings. He owns this jet. He owns the leasing company that employs you. He owns half the private aviation infrastructure on this entire seaboard." The words hit Vanessa like a physical, devastating blow to the chest. The breath was violently knocked out of her lungs. Elias Thorne. She didn't recognize the face, because Elias famously avoided the press, utilizing an army of proxy executives to run his ruthless empire. But absolutely everyone in the private aviation sector knew the name. He was a phantom. a lethal corporate predator who dismantled legacy airlines and swallowed international conglomerates whole. He was known for being brutally efficient, flawlessly quiet, and entirely unforgiving. Vanessa's perfectly painted lips parted, but no sound came out. The pristine, immaculate world she had built for herself over 12 years suddenly began to violently shatter. She looked back through the narrow gap in the wooden partition. Suddenly, her hypercritical eyes saw everything completely differently.
The scuffed, heavy leather boots weren't the mark of a poor construction worker. They were the boots of a man who simply didn't care about impressing anyone because he already owned everything. The faded, unwashed denim jacket wasn't a sign of poverty. It was the ultimate arrogant flex of a billionaire who could board a $70 million aircraft, looking however he damn well pleased. And the cheap canvas duffel bag. It wasn't garbage. It was a tactical, low-profile burner bag, explicitly chosen so he could travel through the city completely unrecognized. The blood drained entirely from Vanessa's face, leaving her a pale, sickly white. A wave of profound, nauseating terror crashed over her. She had just verbally abused a billionaire. She had mocked his clothes. She had threatened to have him thrown in handcuffs. And worst of all, she had yelled in front of his sleeping child. "No," Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling violently. No, that's impossible. He didn't
show me any ID, because he didn't have to." Marcus shot back, his eyes wide with frantic urgency. "Listen to me very carefully, Vance. You are going to step out there. You are going to apologize. And then you are going to pray to God he doesn't decide to ruin your entire life." Marcus didn't wait for her response. He turned, aggressively signaled his backup officer, and practically sprinted down the air stairs, desperate to get off the aircraft and distance himself from the catastrophic blast radius of Vanessa's mistake. Vanessa was left completely alone in the forward galley with Julian. The junior flight attendant was pressed flat against the polished espresso machine, looking at Vanessa with a sickening mixture of shock and morbid pity. Panic, raw and suffocating, finally took hold of Vanessa. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had to fix this. She had to use her charm, her professionalism, her 12 years of experience to smooth this over. It was just a misunderstanding. Surely a man that powerful would understand she was simply protecting his assets. She stepped back out from behind the partition. Her legs felt like heavy lead. The aggressive, confident click of her designer heels was gone, replaced by a slow, trembling shuffle. She stopped at the edge of the rear cabin. Elias was still sitting in the exact same position, his massive hand resting protectively over the sleeping little girl. He was staring out the window again. Mr. Thorne," Vanessa stammered. Her artificially sweet customer service voice was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, reedy squeak. She clasped her hands together tightly to stop them from shaking. "Sir, I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea. I was simply trying to adhere to the strictest security protocols to protect this aircraft, to protect your property."
It was a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Please accept my deepest apologies. She waited for him to turn around. She waited for him to nod, to accept her pathetic groveling, to give her some tiny sign that she wasn't about to lose everything. Elias didn't look at her. He didn't even blink. It was as if she simply did not exist in his universe anymore. Instead, Elias slowly reached into the inside pocket of his worn denim jacket. He pulled out a sleek, heavy, custom-encrypted satellite phone. It was completely black, devoid of any brand markings. He didn't look at the screen. He simply pressed a single speed dial button and raised the device to his ear. The absolute silence in the cabin was so thick that Vanessa could clearly hear the faint, singular ring of the connection. The call was answered immediately on the first ring. Elias did not offer a greeting. He didn't explain the situation.
He kept his pale, icy gray eyes locked firmly on the frosted tarmac outside the window. His deep, rumbling voice broke the silence, delivering three simple words with the heavy, inescapable finality of an executioner's axe falling on a chopping block. "It's done. Start." He lowered the phone, ending the call, and slipped it quietly back into his jacket. Vanessa stood frozen in the aisle, a cold, terrifying dread pooling deep in her stomach. She didn't know who he had called. She didn't know what he had started. But looking at the terrifying absolute stillness of the man sitting in the chair, she knew with absolute, sickening certainty that her life as she knew it was already over. The heavy, pressurized cabin door of the Gulfstream G650ER sealed shut with a thick mechanical thud that sounded entirely too much like a vault, locking permanently from the outside. Within minutes, the massive jet was taxiing down the private runway, its twin Rolls-Royce engines spooling up with a deep, bone-rattling roar, as the aircraft violently accelerated and tore itself away from the freezing Chicago tarmac. Pitching upwards into the bleak gray November sky, Vanessa Vance sat rigidly strapped into the forward jump seat. Her perfectly manicured hands were gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white. Usually, the moment the jet leveled out and the seatbelt chime pinged, Vanessa would unbuckle with practiced grace. She would smooth her tailored navy skirt, retrieve the chilled vintage champagne, and step confidently into the rear cabin to command the room. Today, when the gentle chime echoed through the cabin, she didn't move a single muscle. She was physically trapped in a luxurious $70 million flying purgatory. The air in the forward galley felt terrifyingly thin, heavy with a thick, suffocating dread that made it genuinely difficult to breathe. The absolute silence, bleeding through the Macassar ebony partition from the rear cabin, was far worse than any screaming match. It was the heavy, glacial silence of a man who had already executed his judgment and no longer considered her to be a living, breathing entity. Across the narrow galley aisle, Julian unbuckled his harness. The junior flight attendant didn't look at Vanessa. He moved with extreme, agonizing caution, terrified of making even the slightest noise. He quietly prepared a small porcelain plate of fresh fruit and a glass of warm milk, presumably for the little girl, entirely bypassing Vanessa's meticulously arranged caviar platter. Vanessa's trembling hands dropped from the armrests. Desperate for any semblance of control, she reached into the discreet side pocket of her seat and pulled out her company-issued iPad. She needed to check the flight logs. She needed to message the director of in-flight services at Obsidian's leasing company to spin her side of the story before Marcus filed his security report. She tapped the screen with a shaking, flawlessly painted fingernail. The screen illuminated. But instead of the familiar blue interface of the Obsidian employee portal, a harsh, solid black screen stared back at her. In the center, in stark white, uncompromising text, were two words: access revoked. Vanessa's breath hitched in her throat. A cold, sickly sweat broke out across her forehead. She furiously tapped the screen again, trying to force a hard reboot. Nothing happened. The device had been remotely wiped. The three words Elias had spoken into his satellite phone: "It's done. Start." Were already detonating across her life. "Julian," Vanessa whispered, her voice a fragile, reedy crackle. "Julian, my tablet is locked. The network is completely shutting me out." Julian stopped pouring the milk. He carefully set the crystal pitcher down on the granite counter and finally turned to look at her. There was no sympathy in his eyes. Only the cold, brutal judgment of someone watching a person who had arrogantly walked straight into a spinning helicopter rotor. "What did you expect, Vanessa?" Julian whispered back, his voice thick with a mixture of terror and disgust. "You just threatened to have Elias Thorne dragged off his own aircraft in handcuffs. You insulted his clothes. You yelled in front of a grieving orphaned child." Vanessa swallowed hard, the sharp taste of bile rising in the back of her throat. "I didn't know," she pleaded desperately, the arrogant superiority completely stripped from her face. "How could I have known? Look at how he's dressed. Billionaires don't wear unwashed denim and dirty boots. It makes absolutely no sense." Julian leaned closer, resting his hands flat on the counter. "He isn't just a billionaire, Vanessa. He's a ghost. He's the apex predator that other richer men are terrified of. And he didn't dress down to trick you or insult your ridiculous standards. He's wearing those clothes because he hasn't slept in 3 days." Vanessa stared at him, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. What are you talking about?" "I read the restricted security briefings for this tail number while you were busy polishing champagne flutes." Julian hissed, his eyes wide. "That little girl, her father was Elias Thorne's absolute closest friend, his protector. 3 weeks ago, he took a bullet that was meant for Elias. He died bleeding out on a warehouse floor." The blood drained from Vanessa's face so fast she felt physically dizzy. Her manicured hands flew up to cover her mouth. "That cheap canvas bag you sneered at." Julian continued mercilessly twisting the psychological knife deep into Vanessa's shattered ego. "It contains everything that little girl has left in the world. And that dirty jacket, those scuffed work boots, Elias didn't come from a boardroom today, Vanessa. He came from tearing apart the criminal syndicate responsible for that bullet entirely by himself. He is taking that little girl to her grandmother's house because he promised a dying man he would protect her. He is a man running on absolute violent grief and a sacred promise." Vanessa felt the floor of the Gulf Stream drop out from beneath her. A wave of pure, absolute horror violently crashed over her. She hadn't just insulted a rich man in disguise. She had actively, viciously mocked a grieving, deeply traumatized little girl. She had threatened a lethal, heartbroken man who had just spent weeks violently destroying his enemies to keep that child safe. She had looked at the rawest, most agonizing human tragedy, and her only reaction was to complain that it was ruining her custom silk carpet. Julian picked up the silver tray with the fruit and milk. "Stay back here," he ordered sharply, abandoning any pretense of junior respect. "Do not speak to him. Do not look at him. If you go out there and upset that little girl again, I genuinely think he might throw you out the emergency exit at 30,000 feet. And I won't stop him." Julian turned and slipped through the heavy wooden partition, leaving Vanessa completely alone. She slumped back against the jump seat, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling loose from its severe French twist. She pulled her knees up tightly together, burying her face in her hands. At 31,000 feet, surrounded by the absolute pinnacle of luxury, Vanessa Vance began to weep silently, finally realizing that she had completely, permanently destroyed herself. The Gulfstream G. 650 ER began its slow, sweeping descent through the thick steel-gray layer of winter clouds hanging heavily over the state of Ohio. The turbulence was mild, registering as nothing more than a faint, rhythmic vibration through the heavily insulated $70 million cabin. In the rear VIP lounge, Elias Thorne sat in the exact same position he had maintained for the entire flight. He hadn't touched the crystal glass of sparkling water Julian had terrifiedly placed on his ebony table. He hadn't looked at a single financial document, nor had he checked his encrypted satellite phone. He was simply a statue, carved from stone, a man holding his breath until his mission was absolutely, definitively complete. The subtle shift in cabin pressure as the aircraft dropped below 10,000 feet finally stirred the little girl. Mia stretched beneath the heavy wool blanket, her tiny hands tightening instinctively around the frayed, floppy ear of her stuffed rabbit. She rubbed her eyes, blinking rapidly against the soft LED lighting, and looked up at the massive man sitting across from her. "Uncle Eli," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. The terrifying, icy void in Elias's pale gray eyes vanished instantly, melting into a profound, aching gentleness. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face closer to her level. "I'm right here, little bird," he answered, his deep, gravelly voice a rumbling fortress of absolute safety. "Are we there yet?" Mia asked, sitting up slowly and letting the blanket fall to her waist. "Almost," Elias said softly, reaching out with his scarred, heavily calloused hand to gently smooth down her messy dark curls. "We're about to land. Your Nana is waiting for you." Mia's face lit up with a fragile, hesitant smile. It was a heartbreakingly small expression of joy on a face that had seen entirely too much sorrow over the last 3 weeks. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest, her small legs swinging lightly off the edge of the oversized leather seat.
The jet touched down smoothly at a private aviation field just outside of Columbus. It didn't taxi towards the main brightly lit terminal. Instead, under Elias's strict, prearranged instructions, the pilot steered the massive black aircraft toward a remote, completely isolated stretch of tarmac at the far edge of the perimeter fence. There were no flashing lights here, no red carpets, no sycophantic corporate greeting committees eagerly waiting to shake the CEO's hand. Through the frosted oval window, the only thing waiting on the cold, desolate concrete was a single, unremarkable dark gray sedan. Standing beside the open rear door of the car was an older woman. She wore a thick, dark wool coat, her silver hair pulled tightly back to withstand the biting Ohio wind. She looked physically fragile, her shoulders slightly stooped under the crushing weight of fresh, unimaginable grief. But she possessed an undeniable, hardened strength. This was Eleanor, Mia's grandmother.
She had buried her only son just 2 weeks ago. Now, she was standing in the freezing cold, waiting desperately for the only piece of him left in the entire world. The Gulfstream's massive engine spooled down into a low, quiet whine. The heavy cabin door unsealed with a mechanical hiss, and the exterior air stairs slowly extended toward the tarmac. Inside the cabin, Elias stood up. He didn't bother to button his worn denim jacket against the bitter cold waiting outside. He gently scooped Mia into his massive arms, wrapping the thick wool blanket securely around her small frame to protect her from the wind. With his free hand, he grabbed the cheap, frayed canvas duffel bag containing everything she owned. He walked slowly down the aisle, his heavy leather boots making no sound against the custom silk carpet. As he passed through the forward galley, he completely ignored the space.
He didn't even cast a single glance at Vanessa Vance, who was currently pressed flat against the wall, her eyes red-swollen and leaking silent, terrified tears. Elias didn't need to look at her. He had already erased her from his world. Elias ducked his head through the cabin door and stepped out onto the top of the air stairs. The freezing Ohio wind immediately whipped at his dark, unkempt hair, but he didn't flinch. He carried Mia down the metal steps with slow, deliberate, fiercely protective care. As his boots hit the solid concrete of the tarmac, Mia lifted her head from his broad shoulder. She saw the woman in the dark coat standing just 30 feet away. "Nana," Mia cried out, her small voice shattering the freezing silence of the airstrip. Elias gently set her down on her feet. Mia didn't hesitate. She ran across the cold concrete as fast as her little legs could carry her, the heavy wool blanket trailing behind her like a cape. Eleanor dropped heavily to her knees, right there on the freezing tarmac, disregarding the cold entirely. She caught Mia in her arms, burying her face into the little girl's neck, completely collapsing into a fierce, desperate embrace. The sound that escaped the older woman's lips wasn't words. It was a shattered, guttural sob of a mother who had lost everything, suddenly holding her reason to keep breathing. Elias stood a few feet away, an immovable mountain of a man in faded denim and scuffed boots, quietly watching them. The lethal, freezing void in his pale gray eyes finally cracked just for a fraction of a second, revealing a bottomless, agonizing depth of sorrow. The phantom CEO, the ruthless corporate predator, was gone. In his place was simply a man mourning his fiercely loyal best friend. After a long, deeply emotional moment, Eleanor slowly looked up over Mia's small shoulder. Her face was heavily streaked with tears, her breath curling into white plumes in the freezing air. She looked at Elias. She didn't ask questions. She knew exactly what her son had done for a living, and she knew exactly who the giant, terrifying man standing before her was. She looked at the cheap canvas bag Elias had gently set on the ground. Then she looked directly into his icy gray eyes. "You kept your word," Eleanor whispered, her voice violently trembling, barely carrying over the wind. "You brought her home." Elias offered a single slow nod. His massive jaw tightened, fighting back the heavy surge of grief in his own chest. "He took the bullet meant for me, Eleanor," Elias replied, his voice a low, rough rasp. "I owe him my life. I will make sure she never wants for anything. My security detail is already established around your neighborhood. You will never see them, but they will never leave. She is perfectly safe."
Eleanor closed her eyes, letting out a ragged breath of pure relief. "Thank you, Elias." "Goodbye, little bird," Elias murmured softly, looking down at Mia. Mia pulled away from her grandmother, just enough to look at him. She offered him a small, brave wave with the hand that wasn't clutching her rabbit. "Bye, Uncle Eli." Elias turned around. As he walked back toward the waiting jet, the profound vulnerability vanished entirely from his posture. With every heavy step up the metal stairs, his face hardened the icy, terrifying void, sliding perfectly back into place. The grieving father figure was gone. The ruthless, untouchable CEO had returned, and he had one final piece of business to finish on board. Elias Thorne stepped back onto the plush, custom-woven silk carpet of the Gulfstream G650ER. The heavy cabin door hissed shut behind him, sealing the aircraft in a pressurized, absolute silence. He didn't cast a single glance towards the forward galley. He didn't acknowledge Julian, who was standing stiffly at attention, and he certainly didn't look at Vanessa Vance, who was currently trembling violently in the jump seat, her face buried in her hands. Elias simply walked back to the rear VIP lounge. He sat down in the same oversized leather lounger, resting his massive scarred hands on his knees. He looked across the aisle at the empty seat where Mia had been sleeping just moments ago. He stared at the spot where her cheap canvas duffel bag had rested. The profound, aching gentleness was entirely gone from his face. The phantom CEO, the terrifying architect of corporate destruction, had fully returned to his throne. The jet engines spooled up with a deafening roar, tearing the aircraft away from the Ohio tarmac and pointing its nose back toward Chicago. For Vanessa, the short flight back was a waking nightmare. It was a descent into a suffocating psychological hell. She couldn't breathe.
Her chest felt as though it was wrapped in heavily weighted iron bands. Her company-issued iPad remained completely dark, a lifeless brick locking her out of the secure network she had arrogantly believed she controlled. She desperately checked her personal cell phone, refreshing her inbox over and over again, terrified of what she would find. Julian didn't speak a single word to her. He went about his duties with meticulous silent efficiency, actively pretending she didn't exist. He knew just as Vanessa knew that she was a walking ghost. The execution had already been ordered. She was simply waiting for the axe to fall. When the Gulfstream finally touched down at the private O'Hare terminal and rolled to a smooth stop on the restricted apron, the suffocating tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. The heavy door opened, letting in the biting Chicago wind. Julian stood by the exit, his hands clasped behind his back. Elias emerged from the rear cabin. He didn't stop.
He didn't pause to offer a final gloating insult. He didn't demand an apology from the woman who had threatened to have him thrown out in handcuffs. To Elias Thorne, Vanessa Vance was less than an insect. She was an absolute nothing. He walked silently past her, his heavy leather boots thudding against the metal stairs as he descended to the tarmac, disappearing into the waiting unmarked black SUV. Vanessa watched the taillights of the SUV vanish into the morning fog. She was entirely alone. Suddenly, the sharp piercing ring of her personal cell phone shattered the dead silence of the forward galley. Vanessa flinched violently, dropping the phone onto the granite counter. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. Director of Operations, Obsidian Leasing. It was the highest-ranking executive in her chain of command, the man who had hired her 12 years ago. With a shaking, flawlessly manicured hand, Vanessa answered the call, pressing the phone slowly to her ear.
Hello, Vanessa? The director's voice was completely devoid of warmth. It wasn't angry. It was terrifyingly flat, carrying the cold bureaucratic efficiency of a firing squad. Do not speak. You will listen. Vanessa choked back a sob, her perfectly painted lips trembling. 3 minutes after takeoff this morning, the director continued, I received a direct encrypted call from the principal owner of this leasing company. I was informed of a catastrophic breach of security protocol, gross insubordination, and the severe verbal harassment of a highly protected minor. As of this exact moment, your employment with Obsidian is permanently terminated. Please. Vanessa gasped, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. Please, I didn't know who he was. He wasn't dressed like a client. It was a mistake. It doesn't matter who he was. The director cut in smoothly, slicing through her desperate excuses like a scalpel. You don't treat human beings like garbage simply because you believe they lack the capital to destroy you. You evaluated a man's entire worth based on a worn denim jacket, and you threatened to unleash armed security on a grieving child. You didn't make a mistake, Vanessa. You revealed exactly who you are. Vanessa's knees buckled slightly. She braced her hand against the cold granite counter to keep from collapsing. Your security clearance has been completely revoked, the director finished. You are blacklisted across the entire global private aviation network. Your pension and severance are permanently frozen due to extreme gross misconduct. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings and exit the aircraft. Security will escort you off the airport property. Do not ever contact this company again. The line went dead. A sharp, hollow dial tone echoed in Vanessa's ear. She lowered the phone.
The pristine multi-million-dollar cabin around her suddenly felt like an elaborate tomb. For 12 years, she had worshipped at the altar of extreme wealth, looking down on anyone she deemed unworthy. She had built her entire identity on the snobbish exclusion of others. Now, the very world she had aggressively gatekept had casually crushed her under its heel, not out of malice, but because she simply wasn't worth the energy it took to tolerate her. Julian picked up his own small bag and walked past her toward the exit. He stopped at the door, glancing back at her one final time. "You always said you knew exactly who belonged on this jet, Vanessa," he said quietly. "I guess you were finally right." He walked down the stairs, leaving her completely alone in the freezing cabin. Vanessa Vance fell to her knees on the custom silk carpet she had prized so highly, covering her face as she sobbed into the heavy, terrifying silence.
The wealthy, untouchable world had closed its doors, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of her own arrogance. Some men don't need to raise their voices to destroy you. Sometimes all it takes is 3 simple words and a quiet, lethal promise. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If Elias's silent but devastating justice gave you chills, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another dramatic journey. Let's talk down in the comments. Do you think Vanessa deserved to lose absolutely everything for how she treated the little girl, or was the billionaire's revenge too harsh? Drop your thoughts below. Tell us where in the world you are listening from, and we'll see you in the next incredible story.